Hello and welcome to Coffee with Cow. My name is Sheila and I'm the Learn International intern. And here with me today, we have a study abroad alum, Josh Westhoven. How are you today, Josh?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Great, I'm good. Thank you. We're excited to hear your story. For those of you who are unaware, Cow is our Learn International mascot, and she travels everywhere we go. Coffee with Cow is a podcast that aims to capture and share stories from student alum as well as international educators. And today, like I said, we have Josh. Josh, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So I'm Josh Westhoven. I'm currently a senior at George Mason University. I'm studying computer science. And my study abroad with Learn International, I studied folklore and did an ethnography in Ireland.
Great. What do you know when you did that program?
Oh yeah, the program was from late December 2019 through mid-January 2020.
Okay, great. Good to know. So I want to start off with the first question that you might resonate with your whole study abroad experience. But once you've returned from your study abroad experience, what was the first moment or story that you shared with family or friends when they asked you, how was your study abroad experience?
I think one of the stories that really stuck out is, like I said, since we were there from around December 28th is when the program started. So we were there for, not Christmas, but for a lot of the early holidays. And so what was really cool was seeing like the different, like you sort of had more of you could see people celebrating, like all the 12 days of Christmas and sort of the holidays being stretched out a bit farther than they are in the United States.
Hmm.
And one of the really cool things was being there on New Year's Eve. We were staying on Achill Island, which is in like the northwest corner of Ireland off, it's its own island over there. But on New Year's Eve, they had a tradition where they had a bunch of pipe bands that were on the island would, ring in the new year, playing Auld Lang Syne at, different places across the island, starting at midnight. And then from there, people would march with them to all congregate at a church where they'd all meet up and start playing together. So it was really cool getting to, we were just hanging out at a pub until midnight, waiting for the new year to start, and then walking outside, seeing the pipe band, and then marching with this huge crowd of people, across the island. We were out till like 2 a.m., walking around and listening to music. And then the next morning, there's also another tradition where on New Year's Day, people would go out and take a swim in the ocean. It's freezing cold.
Mm-hmm.
As part of it was raising money for the local, forget the word, like for the lifeboats, for people doing that sort of service. So there's people taking donations, but you get, it was really cool, being just, there's a few of us students, about 5 of us did it, myself included. And so we got to, be in this huge crowd of people who are just, hanging around, this is just the yearly tradition, running in the water, getting freezing cold, swimming back out, and then walking over to an inn nearby where they were serving hot whiskey, warming yourself up and hearing a band play music. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, first it sounds cold, but it also sounds like a really unique experience. I find that if any time I'm in another country, and if I were to get to experience a holiday, I feel like it takes you to a whole different level of really submerging yourself into the culture. So that was pretty neat that you got to be there for New Year's Eve as well as New Year's Day tradition in Ireland.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, definitely. So you were there in Ireland for a couple weeks for an academic program. Tell us what you did for credits while you were over in Ireland.
Yeah, so we were studying folklore and we were doing an ethnography. So a lot of what we were doing was, especially in Achill, it was talking to local musicians, local teachers, people who were very familiar with Irish history and folklore, and talking to them to get a sense of the community and sort of learning their story and like what they thought of as their community and their traditions and things like that. So we got a lot of cool things talking about. There is range from things. There's a woman who worked in she worked for the government doing programs to try to increase, literacy for the Irish language.
Oh, wow.
The place where we stayed in Achill is what's called a Gaeltacht, where the majority of people actually are fluent in Irish and speak it in day-to-day life, which isn't, it's around 20% of the population is fluent, and even lower speak it, day to day.
Mm-hmm.
And so got to talk with things like that. We talked with a guy, his name's escaping me, but it's somebody who like, he made a very specific type of pipe, which like the practice of playing that type of pipe almost went extinct like 20 years ago. And, he bought like an antique set of them, measured them himself, and now machines them, as his job. He creates them by hand, and getting to hear them, like very specialized musicians like that, as well as, just people in the community who, play the fiddle and, hang out and play with other people as a community. So part of that was all of our credit, was going around and meeting local people, talking to them, and just sort of getting to know them. And as part of that, we all had to do interviews. So what I did is, a lot of people were planning like, oh, I'll interview this person who we're going to meet with, like, I'll talk to somebody in the pipe band, or I'll talk to this. And so actually on New Year's Eve, when we were at the pub, I was outside. A few of the people on the trip smoked, so I was just out with them. I don't, but we stepped outside to get a breath of fresh air, and we were standing there, and this guy came outside and he started just talking to us a mile a minute, very friendly. And I think there was a dog who was running around. Somebody's dog was just outside the pub hanging around, and we were talking a bit like that. And you were saying, he scared us. It was almost like a ghost. And he starts telling us these ghost stories. And he's like, oh yeah, like this is what I do as a living. Like I tell ghost stories and other things. And he tells us all these stories, not only about like the ghost stories themselves, but about him telling them, and how he would like, have people in the audience come up, and he would like have a book with their name in it already without them knowing how, and all these other things. He's just this, wild character. And it was a lot of fun talking to him. And I was like, oh, he was really interesting. I think my professor actually was out there in the lower half and was like, that's a really interesting guy. And so I was like, that was cool. And I didn't think about it too much. And then the next day when we were doing the swim, I bumped into him, and we were both just sitting there in swim trunks, about to dive into the ocean.
Wow.
And you're chatting with him again. And so we set up a time for me to get to talk and interview with him. The name is Patrick Stack O'Neill. Did like immigration research. He talked about his ghost stories. Just one of the most interesting people I'd ever met. But it was really cool getting to know him, just because he was talking about himself. He helped do research about the effects of immigration on parents. So what it's like if you have, if you're a parent, how well, there's a lot of, for what his sort of pitch for is, there's a lot of research about how people who immigrate, how they cope to culture shock, but not as much about, if you're a parent, and all of your kids move out and they travel to different countries, what that's like for you. So he sort of was doing research on different factors for how parents handle that. And he himself had just moved to ACL, and he was himself was like, starting to like try to, in a way, like almost reverse renovate an old house that had been there. It was from the early 1900s or maybe 1800s, but there'd been all this whole facade built over it. And so I got to see he was sort of like tearing away the drywall to get the original stone back in there and things like that. So I got to see, the house he was building, meet with him and talk about his research. And then it was even funnier is when he came to the hostel where we were staying, he came with his brother, who apparently was a falconry, who did falconry. And so it was funny as I was going to interview him, and people were excited to get to talk to him. And then his brother showed up, and he's like, oh, I have like this eagle in the back of the van we came in. And that was immediately the hit as everybody running out to be like, oh my God, he has an eagle. Like, I want to see this. He just pulls out this huge bird. And it was even funnier as his brother was like completely subdued, much more, quiet, not as talkative at least at first. I didn't get to talk to him as much since I was interviewing Patrick, but it was very funny. It shows up and just has this massive bird, in the back of his van, just driving around. So that was one of the things where it was really cool to have sort of that, it was almost like, at least for me, like, the ideal way when you're doing this sort of project where you're, about getting the folklore. It's, you don't want to like sort of put people under a microscope. It's, you want to go there with a, just to understand what they're doing, to learn more with a genuine curiosity. And it was really cool having the idea of, of getting the chance where you just, bump into somebody who's, just very gregarious, very talkative, and has so many interesting things to tell you, and getting to really spend time talking to them and hearing about, what it's like to live in the area.
Definitely. That's very interesting. He sounds like quite a character. I mean, you were able to meet someone. He was able to take you along to other sites where he could show you the home, and he could introduce you to more people such as his brother, and introduce you to his brother's craft, which is pretty interesting. So he was considered your subject for your project. Would you say his character was more more entertaining, or did you really get a sense of like an Irish culture knowledge while you were talking to him for your project?
I think I got a lot of ideas about the culture. I think a lot of the research there is that, when you talk to people, you get an idea of who they are, but when you talk to more and more people, you sort of get an idea of what the culture's like. And so you get to learn things about how, like, I was learning stuff like I said, he's very gregarious, he tells stories, he talks a lot. And I know some people, like, we actually met some people in town who are like, oh, like, I don't know, like, he kind of gives me bad vibes. And we were like, why would that be? And it was, in the end, when he was talking to him, is like the overwhelming thing to see me. He's just very much more talkative and much more outgoing in like a very small town community. Ackle is a very
interesting
insular place. So I like, it could be wrong, but as, getting to talk to him, it's like, okay, like this might be like sort of how it is to move into this community from outside, especially, he was moving into the house of somebody, like, I think I forget what the guy's name was, but, he was buying the house from a man who had lived there and had died, a while ago. And he's like, this will never, it's like, to anybody in this neighborhood, this will never be, Pat O'Neill's house. This will always be, John's house, because it was John who lived here and everybody else knew it was John for generations. And if he gave the address, people would be like, oh, I don't know where that is. And he'd say, oh, it's like, John's house. And you're like, oh, John's house, I know where that is, and stuff like that. And, getting to hear, like, you can learn a lot about the culture from the stories, the stories he tells, how people would react to them. It was really cool hearing them, he's telling these ghost stories, and they did sound, pretty scary. I don't want to, crib his stories on the podcast, but it was interesting hearing, like, when he described reactions from people, and it sounded like, much stronger than I would expect in a crowd in the United States, and things like that, having much more of an emphasis on sort of that oral tradition of people, a guy who can have regular gigs where he goes to, places around Halloween and does, scary stories in pubs and things like that. Like, that's something I couldn't imagine, around where I live.
Mm-hmm. That's definitely interesting. I really like the point that you said. He looks into the listeners' reactions as a storyteller. That's quite interesting. I bet he kind of crafts the story around reactions he's had in the past, and how he kind of what's the word, projects the story to the next person he tells it to.
Yeah, and it was very interesting hearing them sort of hearing the story of the story is different, because if you got the original story itself, where he would do these, a lot of it was things where he would have like a person in the audience pull out a book from the shelf and pick a random page, and they'd open it up and his name would be there, things are just very spooky. And so it was funny, because you hear that story, and that story, if you're experiencing that, that's scary, but then his telling of it was sort of its own, the story of the story was very funny, because you're getting the reactions of the poor guy who's been pulled out of the audience. He shows him this book and he finds his name in it, and he's like, oh, you can keep the book. And the guy's like, I will never take this book. He's like, how am I supposed to go to sleep with this book on my shelf knowing where it's from? He's like, I'm not touching that. And so it sort of turns back to humor, where you have there's like, as the story is told, and sort of different perspectives on it as well.
Yeah, it's very unique. That's such a cool experience, especially gaining all that from meeting someone, hearing great stories, all that from a project you had while you were studying abroad.
It was a really great opportunity to be able to do something like this that was just really interesting, that I could sort of do, just out of curiosity.
Would you recommend this program for someone who's looking to fulfill those credits?
Oh yeah, definitely. I think it's a really great opportunity to just get to learn a whole lot in a very short amount of time.
That's true. That's great. It's great to hear. Well, Josh, I want to thank you so much for being here today. Learn and myself really appreciate your time.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. You can find this podcast on our Learn International YouTube channel, and we'll publicize this specific podcast on our social media platforms such as Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn, and with the hashtag LearnINTL. And yeah, we look forward to our next guest, but make sure you tune into this one with Josh and hear some great stories. And Josh, we hope you stay safe and well, and thanks again for being here today.
Yeah, thank you. You too.
All right, take care. Bye.
Bye.